Son-in-law put my dinner plate on the floor, not on the counter, not on the side table, on the floor, like you'd set down a bowl for a dog. And my daughter stood right there in the kitchen doorway and said nothing. That was Christmas Eve, 2023, and that was the last night I stayed quiet. My name is Alistair Dunmore. I'm 67 years old, retired civil engineer, and I've lived in Barrie, Ontario my whole adult life. I raised one child, my daughter Cassandra, in a 3-bedroom house on Collier Street after her mother passed from cancer in 2009. Just the two of us for a long time. We managed. I made sure she had everything she needed for university, helped her with her first car, showed up to every milestone she let me be part of. I was proud of her. I still am, in the way that you can love someone and still have to reckon with what they allowed to happen. She met Bryce at a conference in Toronto 4 years ago. He was a financial consultant. His words, working with a mid-sized firm on Bay Street. He had a firm handshake and a good suit, and he laughed at the right moments during dinner. I didn't dislike him at first. I want to be clear about that. I gave him every fair chance a man could give. But there were small things early on. The way he talked over Cassandra when she started a sentence. The way he checked his phone during meals but looked around like he was daring someone to say something. The way he referred to my house, to this house I'd owned for 22 years, as that place up in Barrie, when he thought I couldn't hear. They married in the summer of 2022. I gave them a gift of $30,000 to help with the down payment on a condo in Mississauga. I didn't ask for anything back. That's not why I mention it. I mention it because it matters later. The Christmas visit was planned weeks in advance. Cassandra had called me in November, cheerful, saying Bryce's family would be coming down from Sudbury and that there'd be a full house. But I should absolutely come for Christmas Eve dinner. Come at 5, she said. We'll eat around 6. I should have read something into the fact that she said come for dinner rather than come and stay, but I didn't. I loaded up the car, picked up a bottle of wine from the LCBO and a box of Purdy's chocolates, because Cassandra had loved them since she was a child, and I drove down the 400. When I arrived, the condo was loud. Bryce's parents were there, his brother and sister-in-law, 2 young cousins running circles in the hallway. The table was set for 8. I counted the chairs before I even took off my coat. There were 8 chairs, 8 people already accounted for, and none of them were me. Cassandra came to the door looking flustered. She hugged me quickly, took the chocolates and said, "Dad, I'm so glad you made it." Then she disappeared into the kitchen. Bryce appeared from the living room with a drink in his hand, looked at me and said, and I remember this exactly because I've replayed it more times than I can count. "We weren't really expecting you to stay for the whole thing. We kind of ran out of room." I looked at him. I said, "Cassandra invited me for dinner." He shrugged. "It got bigger than we planned. You can hang around for a bit if you want." Hang around? In my daughter's home? On Christmas Eve? I stood in the front hallway for a moment. I could hear everyone laughing in the other room. I could smell the turkey roasting. I had driven 90 minutes in December traffic. I went to the kitchen to find Cassandra. She was plating something, her back to me. I touched her shoulder and she turned, and the look on her face, not guilt exactly, more like inconvenience, told me everything I needed to know about what she'd known going into that evening. "Dad," she said, "I'll fix you a plate. You can eat in the den. There's a TV in there." The den, like I was a child being sent away from the grown-up table. I said, "That's all right," very quietly. I put on my coat. She said, "You're not staying." I said, "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," and I walked to the door. Bryce was back in the hallway. He looked at me leaving and there was something on his face, not relief, something more satisfied than that. He reached past me and opened the door, and then, I don't know if it was a joke or if he meant it exactly as it felt, he picked up the plate Cassandra had just handed him from the kitchen, a small dish of leftovers she'd already been scooping together, and he set it on the floor just inside the door, like a parting gesture, like you leave something out for an animal. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. I looked at the plate on the floor. I looked at him. I looked down the hall toward the kitchen, where my daughter had gone back to whatever she was doing. I stepped over the plate, walked out the door, and didn't say a word. The drive home was quiet. I had the radio on CBC, but I wasn't hearing it. I kept my hands steady on the wheel. It wasn't until I pulled into my own driveway, sat in the dark car for a few minutes, that I let myself understand what had actually just happened. My son-in-law had put food on the floor for me, and my daughter had let him. That night I didn't sleep well. I made tea around 2 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table where I'd helped Cassandra with homework 100 times. I thought about my late wife, Janet, what she would have said, what she would have done. I thought about the $30,000. I thought about some other things too. Because here's what Bryce didn't know. 6 months earlier, Cassandra had come to me privately without telling him. She'd said things were tight, that Bryce's business had some cash flow problems, that they were a bit behind on the condo fees and a small line of credit. She'd asked if I could help. I had said yes. I'd written a personal check for $22,000 meant as a loan. We agreed on that. She even signed a simple promissory note I had drawn up because my accountant, a practical man named Gerald Booth, told me I should always formalize it, even with family. $22,000. Signed, filed, on record. And it wasn't just the loan that was sitting in the back of my mind that Christmas night. It was something my neighbor Dennis had mentioned to me back in October. Dennis's son-in-law worked in compliance at a credit union in Barrie, and at a neighborhood barbecue he'd said, carefully and without naming names, that there were some irregular patterns being flagged in certain accounts connected to a consultant whose name I would recognize. He hadn't said more than that. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I started thinking about it now. In January, I called Gerald. I laid out what had happened over Christmas, and I asked him 2 questions. What were my legal rights regarding the promissory note, and who could I talk to about looking into someone's business practices without making accusations I couldn't back up? Gerald gave me the name of a lawyer in Barrie, a woman named Ruth Nakamura, a straightforward and thorough person. I called her the next week. Ruth was careful. She didn't make promises. She said the promissory note was enforceable, clearly drafted, no ambiguity. She also listened to the broader picture I described, the Dennis conversation, some other things I'd started putting together, and she suggested I contact the Ontario Securities Commission's tip line, not to accuse anyone, just to provide information and let them assess it. I did that in February. I heard nothing for 6 weeks. Then in late March, Ruth called me to say she'd been contacted by an investigator at FSRA, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario. They were already looking at Bryce's firm. They didn't tell me details. They didn't have to. The fact that they called told me enough. In the meantime, I had sent a formal demand letter through Ruth's office, registered mail, requesting repayment of the $22,000 within 60 days per the terms of the promissory note. Ruth had also done some background work for me. What she found was this. The condo that Cassandra and Bryce lived in was registered in Bryce's name alone, but the initial purchase records showed I was listed as a gift donor in the mortgage application for the $30,000, which meant the lender had documented my contribution, and Bryce had, in his application, characterized the funds as a gift, not a loan, which created a discrepancy because to me it had always been, at the very least, a moral if not formal loan of that earlier amount. None of this was simple. I'm not going to pretend it was. But I want to tell you what came next. April. Cassandra called me. It was a Sunday morning, I remember, because I was making oatmeal and the maple syrup had run out, and I was annoyed at myself for forgetting to pick some up. She said she needed to talk. I asked if she'd like to come to Barrie. She said yes. She arrived alone. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd sat in the dark on Christmas night. She looked tired. She looked like she'd been carrying something heavy for longer than she was admitting to. I put the kettle on. Neither of us spoke for a minute or two. Then she said, "I know about the investigation." I said, "All right." She said, "Dad, I didn't know about the client money." I told her, I hoped that was true. She said it was, and then she said something that took me off guard, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so quiet. She said, "I'd been scared of him for a while." I put down my mug. I looked at her. She told me things that took about an hour to get through, about how Bryce controlled their finances. She had no access to their main account, only a small account he moved money into for groceries and household expenses, about the way he managed her social life, her friendships, her relationship with me, about the Christmas visit How he had told her it was fine to invite me, but then changed the story, told her his family had a thing about boundaries and that I shouldn't expect to be treated like a guest because it was his home. She had gone along with it. She was ashamed of that. She said so. I'm going to be honest with you. Sitting there listening to my daughter, I felt a lot of things at once. I felt grief, because this had been building for years and I hadn't pushed hard enough to see it. I felt anger, a cold, very specific anger, at the man who had manipulated her so thoroughly that she stood in a kitchen doorway while he set my dinner on the floor. I felt tired, and underneath all of it I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Because she was sitting across from me, she had come. She had told me the truth. I reached over and put my hand over hers. I said, "We're going to figure this out." By May, two separate things were moving forward. Ruth had filed the formal claim for the $22,000 plus legal interest, and the FSRA, we later learned, had launched a full investigation into Bryce's firm, specifically into allegations that he had been investing client funds into unauthorized instruments and pocketing the management fees while recording false returns. The amounts involved were not small. We're talking about losses to clients totaling somewhere in the range of $400,000 across multiple accounts over 3 years. Several of those clients were seniors on fixed incomes. One was a retired schoolteacher in Burlington. One was a recently widowed man from Hamilton who had trusted Bryce with his late wife's life insurance settlement. When I heard that, I thought about Dennis's comment from the barbecue, about Janet, about trust. Bryce was formally charged in June under the Securities Act and the Criminal Code, fraud, misappropriation, breach of fiduciary duty. His registration as a financial advisor was suspended pending the outcome. The firm he worked for, it turned out he was a contracted agent, not a full employee, which had made it easier for him to operate in the gray, terminated its relationship with him immediately and was cooperating with investigators. Cassandra filed for divorce in June as well. She found a family lawyer in Mississauga and started proceedings. Because the condo was in Bryce's name and his assets were frozen as part of the investigation, the situation was complicated. But there was a family law assessment of his declared assets and liabilities, and because Cassandra could demonstrate she had contributed to the household, and because of the documented $30,000 gift that was now in question, her lawyer was working toward an equalization claim. She moved out in late May, before the charges came. I offered her the basement room in Barrie. I didn't charge her rent, not because I had forgotten everything, but because I understood the difference between Bryce's choices and Cassandra's failures. And I knew that making her pay rent right now would be about my hurt, not about what was right. She helped around the house. She started seeing a therapist in Barrie, a woman she found through her benefits coverage. Slowly, over that summer, I watched my daughter come back to herself. The civil judgment on the promissory note came through in September. Bryce was ordered to repay $22,000 plus interest and Ruth's legal fees, totaling just under $26,000. Given that his assets were frozen, it was added to the overall restitution order in the criminal case. Whether I'll see all of it is another question. But it's on record. It exists. His sentencing was in November. He received 2 years less a day, served in the community under strict conditions, including house arrest for 12 months, mandatory repayment to defrauded clients as a condition of his conditional sentence order, surrender of his financial advisor license permanently, and no contact with his former clients. The Crown had pushed for federal time. The judge cited his cooperation with investigators and his lack of prior record in handing down the conditional sentence. I won't pretend that part sat easily with me. 2 years less a day, in your own home, for stealing $400,000 from seniors and widowers. I sat in that courtroom and kept my face still and thought about the retired schoolteacher from Burlington. But the judge also made the restitution order substantial, and the license is gone permanently. Bryce will never register as a financial advisor in this country again. After the sentencing, Cassandra and I walked out of the courthouse together and stood in the cold for a minute. It was November in Barrie, properly cold, that sharp kind of cold that smells like snow. She didn't say much. Neither did I. We walked to the parking garage, and at her car she turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it, for Christmas." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have called you when I picked up that plate and saw what he was doing." I said, "Yes, you should have." We stood there in the cold, and then I said, But you called in April, and you came. She's still in the basement room. She's applied for a position at a civil engineering firm in the city. Funny, like father, like daughter, and she's waiting to hear. She's been going to her appointments. She laughs more than she did over the summer. She brought home maple syrup last week without being asked, because she remembered I'd run out. I keep the promissory note in my filing cabinet, not because I'm angry, but because I'm 67 years old and I've learned that documents matter. That paper is quieter and more patient than any argument you'll ever have in a kitchen doorway. There's a thing I think about sometimes, that night in December, standing at the door of that condo. The plate on the floor. The way Bryce looked at me like he was testing something, measuring how much I'd take. I think about what he expected. He expected me to say something, probably, or to be embarrassed, or to eat it in silence like I had no other choice. He didn't know what he was dealing with. A man who's been patient his whole life learns the difference between patience and surrender. I'm patient. I waited, and I documented, and I made the calls that needed to be made. And one morning in November, I watched a judge read out a sentence while Bryce sat at the defense table, not quite as certain of himself as he'd been on Christmas Eve. That's all. Cassandra made roast chicken for Christmas this year. The two of us sat at my kitchen table in Barrie, the one she sat at her whole life. She'd found a decent Riesling from Niagara. We ate and we talked, and at some point she said something that made me laugh. I can't even remember what it was now, which is a good sign, the kind of thing that means the laugh was real. Later I washed up, and she dried. The way we used to when she was a teenager and Janet was still alive. The three of us rotating through it like a system. She dried the last dish and set it on the counter and said goodnight and went downstairs. I stood in the kitchen for a while after, the way you do at the end of a long year. It was a good Christmas. I've thought about that plate on the floor more times than I can count. Not because it still hurts. It doesn't. Not the way it did that December night, sitting in the dark in my own driveway. I think about it because of what it revealed. Not about Bryce. About me. About what I'd been letting slide for years in the name of keeping the peace. There's a version of that Christmas where I say something in the hallway. Where I raise my voice, make a scene, demand an apology. I used to think that version was the stronger one. I don't anymore. Walking out quietly wasn't weakness. It was the first honest thing I'd done in a long time, being truthful with myself about what was actually happening in that condo, in that relationship, in the years I'd spent handing over money and goodwill to people who'd stopped valuing either. What came after wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. I made calls because it was right to make them. The promissory note existed because Gerald had told me years ago to always put things in writing, and I'd listened. The tip to the FSRA wasn't about settling a score. It was about a retired schoolteacher in Burlington whose savings were gone and who deserved better. Those two things, the loan document, the tip line, weren't acts of anger. They were acts of paying attention, of taking seriously what I knew and doing something responsible with it. Bryce made the mistake that a lot of people make when they look at a quiet man and decide he must be simple. He confused patience with compliance. He saw someone who didn't argue at dinner tables and assumed there was nothing behind the stillness, but I've been still my whole life while building things that last. That's what engineers do. You don't pour a foundation in a hurry. You don't cut corners and hope the structure holds. You measure, you document, you wait for the conditions to be right. Cassandra's mistakes were different. Hers came from fear that had calcified into habit. I've had to sit with that too. The part where I asked myself what I missed, what I could have said years earlier that might have made it easier for her to reach out. I don't have a clean answer, but I know this. When she finally did come and sit at that kitchen table in April, she came because she trusted I wouldn't make her pay for every wrong thing she'd stood by and let happen. That trust was worth protecting. Rebuilding it took longer than one conversation. It still isn't finished, but it's real, which is more than I could say about a lot of things at Christmas the year before. There's a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with credentials or income. It's the intelligence of knowing what you actually have, understanding its value, and refusing to behave as though you owe anyone an apology for protecting it. I had a house, a signed document, relationships with honest professionals, and 67 years of knowing the difference between a man who earns his standing and one who performs it. That knowledge was the whole thing. It was the only advantage I needed. And there's something else, something quieter than all of that, which is that none of it works without the willingness to sit in a cold car for 20 minutes and then get up the next morning and do what needs to be done anyway. Not because you're certain of the outcome, because it's yours to do and no one else is going to do it for you. The plate is long gone. My daughter dried the dishes at Christmas this year. That's what I've got.